Whenever I think of retro studios, the first thing that comes to mind is Metroid or Metroid Prime. It just seems that in this day and age, retro studios is synonymous with Metroid. But the funny thing is that Retro Studios hasn't developed a ground-up Metroid in over 10 years. And with Metroid Prime 4 on the way, we already know that they're not working on that game either. Apparently that game is being developed by Bandai Namco and certain guys at Nintendo. So, yeah, I don't really know what's going on with Retro Studios. We don't know what Retro Studios is doing nowadays, but they've created so many great games over the years that a lot of fans, well, they harbor not resentment, the exact opposite, love and adoration for this studio. So maybe it's a good time to go over a brief history of Retro Studios so we can learn a little bit more about them and maybe sort of figure out what they could be working on in the future. Maybe the best way to get started discussing or going over the history of Retro Studios, we should just first think about what Retro Studios was before it was Retro Studios. So the thing is that Retro Studios is actually founded in 1998 by an alliance between Nintendo and Jeff Spangenberg. Jeff Spangenberg was actually not only the founder for Retro Studios, but also the founder for Iguana Entertainment a few years beforehand. Now, Iguana Entertainment was a developer who is most known for the Turok games in the 90s on a Nintendo 64. Those are some great first-person dinosaur-killing shooting games. They were amazing. It was some of my favorite games during that time. And Nintendo really appreciated those games on the system, but they also realized going into the 21st century that they were going to need someone who could create games for that demographic, that older demographic that was really into the mature Turok games. So then, they created the alliance, they worked on an alliance with, Jeff Spangenberg, and they created Retro Studios in 1998. And for the record, it was at this point that Retro Studios was a second-party studio for Nintendo, but by 2002, Nintendo bought enough stake in the company that they became an official first-party developer for Nintendo. So anything that Retro Studios makes is fully 100% Nintendo, as is the studio. They cannot make anything else for any other companies at this point in time, and it's been that way since 2002. So, with that said, what happened after the Turok games? What happened once Retro Studios became Retro Studios? Well, Jeff Spangenberg actually brought over several key members from the Iguana Entertainment team. So a lot of the experience that came from the Turok guys came into the beginnings of Retro Studios. But, when Retro Studios came to be, they actually were working on 4 different games at once in the beginning. They were working on a football game, a card combat game, this RPG known as Raven Blade, and some weird third-person action-adventure game. Now, none of these games or projects ever came to light. They were all canceled when eventually Metroid Prime came to be. But the truth is that the third-person action-adventure game is what eventually amounted to Metroid Prime. You see, because the thing is, Retro Studios early on was struggling to really juggle all these different projects. So Shigeru Miyamoto came in and saw what they were doing and was a little upset and advised them to focus on this third-person action-adventure and turn it into a Metroid game. And then eventually he also suggested that they turn this into a first-person Metroid game. And they eventually canceled everything else and focused all of their efforts on creating this Metroid game, and by 2002, Metroid Prime was published and released for the Nintendo GameCube. And that game came to a lot of critical acclaim. It's one of the highest reviewed games of all time, one of my personal favorite games of all time, and it sold pretty well for the Nintendo GameCube. Over 2 million copies. That's about 10% of all GameCube owners. That's a really good ratio. Metroid Prime is one of the GameCube's best games, if not its best game. With all the success and excitement for Metroid Prime, Nintendo forced Retro Studios to immediately begin development on the sequel, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. And that game had a very strict deadline of holiday 2004. Just 2 years. They were forced to create an entirely new game. And they didn't even decide to reuse the assets. They built up a lot of new assets for this game. That all said, even with the strict deadline and having only 2 years and creating a lot of new assets, Retro Studios managed to create another stellar game. While the reviews weren't quite as high as the original Metroid Prime, it was still an amazing game and managed to sell about 800,000 copies. And yeah, it did pretty well, although it is known to be the hardest of the Metroid Prime trilogy. Now, around this time, Metroid Prime Hunters was in development for the Nintendo DS. Retro Studios didn't actually make Metroid Prime Hunters, but they did help out the team who was NST by offering out some designs and assets. Retro was actually working on Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. It was initially planned to try to get Metroid Prime 3 out for the launch window of the Nintendo Wii, but the game didn't actually make it out until holiday 2007. And this game included motion and pointer controls, which a lot of people really enjoyed. So much so that they included motion and pointer controls for Metroid Prime 1 and 2 in the Metroid Prime Trilogy compilation that came out in 2009. Now, the Prime Trilogy compilation is an amazing product that is really, really rare. Like, it's super expensive. You go on Amazon or eBay right now to get it. But if you have a Wii U, you can get the digital version for $20, which is pretty nice. Of course, not that many people even have a Wii U, so hopefully Nintendo releases Metroid Prime Trilogy again in the near future. It wasn't until 2010 that Retro finally came out with a non-Metroid game, Donkey Kong Country Returns. Similar to the way Retro Studios brought back the Metroid series, Retro Studios also brought back the Donkey Kong Country series, and Donkey Kong Country Returns did very well, the reviews are very good, and the game sold better than any other Metroid Prime game that Retro developed. In fact, it sold about 5 million on the Nintendo Wii. Now, after that, Retro Studios went on to help out with the development for Mario Kart 7. Initially, they only planned on developing one single stage, the Donkey Kong stage in Mario Kart 7, but because EAD was planning on working on another project as well, Retro Studios ended up developing half the tracks in Mario Kart 7. After that, Retro Studios worked on porting over Donkey Kong Country Returns over to the 3DS while they were developing Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, the sequel to Donkey Kong Country Returns, and that game came out on the Nintendo Wii U in 2014. And now, of course, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is getting ported over to the Nintendo Switch and should be coming out pretty soon. This year being 2018, for whenever people watch this in the future. Now, these are all the games that we know have come out for Retro Studios, all the games that they've been working on, but we don't really know what Retro Studios is working on now. But we do know that a couple months before the release of Tropical Freeze, Retro began development for a whole new game. That was 4 years ago at the time of this recording, so you have to think that something must be nearly done already, but we still don't know what it is. There is a rumor going around that David Wise, the composer for all the Donkey Kong games, who has a history with working Retro Studios with the previous Donkey Kong games, is working with a game developer in Austin, Texas. And guess who's situated in Austin, Texas? Retro Studios. So then maybe they are making another Donkey Kong game. Maybe they're completing the trilogy for Donkey Kong Country the same way they completed the trilogy for Metroid Prime. That would make a lot of sense. But there's one thing that doesn't make a lot of sense. If they created Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, I don't see why they would have to create an entirely new game engine to make a sequel to that game. Especially since it's already in HD. And even if they did, I don't see how it would take them 4 whole years. In fact, maybe more than 4 years, because we still don't know what that game is. So then, what could it be? Because I don't really think a Donkey Kong Country game fits the bill. Maybe it's a 3D Donkey Kong game. David Wise did make the music for Donkey Kong 64, so maybe Retro Studios is making a 3D Donkey Kong game in the vein of Donkey Kong 64 or Banjo-Kazooie. I know a lot of Nintendo fans, myself included, would love the idea of that, so maybe that's what's going on here. Or maybe Retro Studios, the same way they brought back Metroid and Donkey Kong Country, are bringing back another dead Nintendo franchise. Maybe F-Zero. I would love that, but we don't really know what they're working on. This is all speculation. But what do you guys think? After looking throughout the history of Retro Studios, what do you think they could be working on? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all really soon.